I never imagined the day my parents would send me a bill for love. It arrived in a thick, cream-colored envelope, formal and precise, with a single sheet inside. The heading read, Compensation Request for Neglectful Parenting, 15-year account statement. My heart stopped. 15 years. Every ignored birthday, every missed parent-teacher meeting, every holiday I spent alone, now they claimed it had a price. I am Kara Thompson, 28, self-made, and fiercely independent. I grew up in the shadows of their indifference. My parents, Richard and Evelyn Thompson, were successful attorneys who spent more time at galas and board meetings than at home. I learned early that if I wanted dinner on time, comfort, or praise, I had to give it to myself. Yet even now, with the envelope trembling in my hands, I could feel the same old ache, the mix of anger, disbelief, and the unshakable sting of being unwanted. Richard and Evelyn had perfected the art of emotional absence. My childhood memories were marked by empty chairs at school plays and lukewarm dinners where they discussed mergers and lawsuits while I sat silently. Their love was conditional, transactional, and now, apparently, monetizable. Despite this, there had always been a faint thread of hope. I'd tried to please them. Honor roll certificates were framed, cookies baked on weekends, texts sent to update them about my life. But the thread snapped decades ago, leaving me to build my world alone. And build it I did. From the dorm room where I sold handmade jewelry to classmates, to launching Thompson Tech Solutions, which recently hit a staggering $10 million in revenue, I carved my path without guidance, without applause, and without their support. Now, the same people who had ignored me for years were demanding payment, an audacious, surreal claim that made my blood boil. I stared at their signatures at the bottom of the letter, neat, controlled, and smug. I could almost hear them saying, "We raised you, so you owe us." A laugh, half disbelief, half fury, escaped me. There was danger here, though, and not the kind you see coming in courtrooms or contracts. This was a storm built on manipulation, arrogance, and greed. If I wasn't careful, their legal team could tie up my life, distract me from my business, and, God forbid, shake the foundation of the empire I had built alone. But beneath the anger, beneath the shock, a spark ignited. A quiet, dangerous thought, maybe it was time to turn the tables. To let them see what it meant to be held accountable, not with words, but with actions. I folded the letter carefully, my fingers tight around the edges, and whispered to the empty room, "You ignored me for 15 years, now it's my turn." And somewhere deep inside, I knew this wasn't just about money. This was about justice. The following days were like walking through a minefield. Every phone call, every message from my parents felt loaded with a hidden weight. Richard called first. His tone was polished, almost casual. "Kara, we just want to make things fair. You understand, right? It's not personal." It was personal. Every word dripped with the same condescending authority they had wielded when I was 10 and crying because no one showed up at my school play. Evelyn followed a day later, arranging a brunch to discuss the letter. She smiled sweetly, but her eyes were sharp, calculating. "You've grown so successful," she said, patting my hand. "It's only natural to want to contribute to your family's legacy." The subtle manipulations were hard to pinpoint, but the pattern emerged quickly. They twisted conversations, presenting themselves as the victims while painting me as reckless or greedy. Small lies about past family events, half-truths about my upbringing, and selective storytelling began to gnaw at my composure. At a corporate event that week, my father casually dropped a line about how supportive families always recognize the debt owed to them. The remark sounded innocent to everyone else, but to me, it was a reminder of every ignored birthday, every silent plea for attention. Even my younger cousin, Lucas, who lived with them for a few months, returned with stories of favoritism I hadn't noticed, lavish gifts for minor accomplishments, constant praise for things I had done on my own years ago, and subtle reminders that my efforts were always, somehow, insufficient. I started noticing small things at home too. My own apartment felt safer than ever, but the emails from them were relentless, cloaked in legalese and faux concern. I couldn't ignore them, but each interaction left me drained. The emotional toll grew heavier with every conversation, my confidence shook, my stomach knotted, and late at night, I replayed old memories with sharp clarity. One evening, I received a package, an old family photo album, sent without a note. As I flipped through the pages, a picture caught my eye near me, standing alone at my 8th birthday party. Everyone else blurred in the background. My parents' smiles were bright, but they weren't looking at me. The juxtaposition was cruel, intentional, or maybe accidental, but it left a bitter taste. Then came the moment that made my skin crawl. In the middle of a routine email exchange, Richard casually wrote, "We'll be expecting the first installment next week. Let's not make this more difficult than it has to be." I stared at the screen, heart hammering. Was this a joke? A test? Or a threat wrapped in civility? Suddenly, the comfortable world I had built, my thriving company, my independence, my achievements, felt fragile, as though every success I had earned could be undermined by their relentless demands. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. A cold dread crept in, whispering a warning. They've ignored you for years, but now they think they hold the power. And maybe, they're planning something worse than a bill. The unease settled deep in my bones. The game had begun. The next morning, the shock hit me like a sledgehammer. I logged into my bank account and froze. Dozens of wire transfers had been redirected, millions siphoned from the account I had set aside for my startup, the very business I had built from nothing. I could barely breathe. It wasn't just a demand for symbolic payment anymore. Richard and Evelyn had quietly taken action, filing claims against my assets under the guise of unpaid debts for the years of parental neglect. Legal documents had been quietly processed while I slept, asserting that my financial success had been, in part, a benefit derived from parental guidance and care, a laughable notion, given the endless years of absence and indifference. My hands shook as I read through the contracts, the affidavits, and the letters from their lawyers. They had framed it all as if they were owed every achievement I'd ever earned, my college scholarships, my first job, the capital I invested into my own company. It was audacious, calculated, and cruel. I felt my knees weaken, a rush of disbelief and fury flooding me. How could they, how dared they, turn the years of neglect into a weapon against me? Every ignored birthday, every lonely Christmas, every scraped knee I had cleaned myself, suddenly, they had attached a price tag to it, claiming entitlement. The betrayal was personal and devastating. I had given up hope of parental affection long ago, but I hadn't expected them to attack the life I had fought to build. My company, my freedom, my very identity, they were trying to take it from me using the law as their shield. I sank into my chair, heart racing, head spinning. The disbelief morphed into rage, then heartbreak. The parents who should have nurtured me, who should have celebrated my milestones, were now adversaries plotting my ruin. Then came the cruelest detail. Buried in the legal fine print was a clause that could freeze my accounts immediately upon any missed installment. If I failed to respond perfectly, their claim could trigger asset holds, jeopardize payroll, and even threaten the contracts I had painstakingly secured with investors. I clenched my fists until my nails dug into my palms. The room blurred as tears stung my eyes. 15 years of emotional abandonment, compounded by this financial betrayal, it was almost too much to bear. Somewhere in the chaos of my thoughts, a quiet voice whispered, a spark amid the storm. This wasn't just about money. This was about power, control, and their arrogance in thinking I was still a child to be manipulated. I stood abruptly, the chair tipping back. My body was shaking, my mind racing. I could feel the weight of the world pressing down, but beneath it, a resolve began to take shape. I would not let them win. I whispered to the empty room, "You tried to make me pay for your neglect, now it's my turn to collect." The question lingered in the air: how would I fight back, and how far was I willing to go to make them pay for every stolen year? 4 days, I sat in my office, staring at the piles of legal notices and financial statements, feeling as if the walls were closing in. The betrayal ran deeper than money. It was an assault on everything I had fought to build. I felt small, trapped, helpless, until the spark ignited. It came unexpectedly. I was on a call with Jordan Myers, my old mentor from college who had guided me through the early days of my startup. I told him, voice tight with frustration, what my parents had done. "Kara," he said slowly, after a pause, "they think they can intimidate you because they're your parents. But the truth is, they've underestimated you for 15 years. They've spent their whole lives ignoring your strength. That's their mistake." His words struck me like a lightning bolt. He wasn't just offering comfort, he was showing me clarity. For too long, I had let their absence define me, let their neglect shape my worth. But I wasn't powerless. I had built a multi-million-dollar company alone, survived years of loneliness, and fought through obstacles they could never imagine. They weren't gods, they were flawed, greedy, and predictable. That night, I went through every document, every account, every interaction. I realized they had left a trail of arrogance, a roadmap of every manipulative tactic they had used. They had overreached. They had assumed I would be too intimidated to fight back. The realization hit me like a pulse of electricity. I didn't just want to defend myself, I wanted them to understand, in a way they couldn't ignore, the consequences of every year they ignored me. I began mapping a plan. I made lists, evidence I could use, allies I could call on, and the weaknesses in their legal maneuvers. I contacted Laura Chen, a sharp attorney who had handled complex corporate defenses, and together we began building a strategy that was meticulous, thorough, and unstoppable. I spent nights rehearsing conversations, drafting counterclaims, and imagining the moment they would realize that the powerless child they had neglected had grown into a force they could not contain. And slowly, despair transformed into focus. Heartbreak became precision. The rage that had burned helplessly in me now sharpened like a blade, honed into a tool of strategy and justice. Finally, one quiet evening, as the city lights shimmered outside my window, I looked at my reflection in the glass. The woman staring back was no longer frightened or beaten down. She was strong, fearless, and resolute. I whispered to myself, almost ceremoniously, "They ignored me for 15 years, but I've learned how to make them see what it costs to play with me. It's time to collect." The decision settled deep in my chest, calm but unyielding. The battle was no longer about survival, it was about reclaiming every ounce of power they had tried to steal. And with that, I began to move. Revenge, I decided, wasn't going to be loud. It would be surgical, slow, deliberate, and impossible to dismiss. If they wanted to weaponize the law and public opinion, I would use the same tools against them, only cleaner and truer. I mapped it out like a campaign: evidence, allies, timing, and a stage big enough that the world would have to watch. Step 1: gather indisputable proof. Laura and I started by ripping apart the filings my parents' lawyers had submitted. We traced every legacy credit and every phantom expense. I pulled bank statements, emails, old tax returns, and invoices, everything. Jordan introduced me to Sam, a forensic accountant who could turn piles of numbers into a clear narrative: dates, wire routes, beneficiary signatures, and patterns of transfers that matched the timing my parents claimed parental investment. Sam's spreadsheets glowed red with anomalies. Step 2: corroborate with witnesses. Neglect leaves traces: teachers' notes, hospital forms, landlords' logs. I contacted people from my past: a teacher who remembered my parents' missing awards night, an old roommate who had emails proving they ignored financial pleas, even an estranged cousin who'd been quietly passed generous gifts while I got nothing. Each voice added weight. Laura subpoenaed a few documents quietly, careful to avoid tipping them off. Step 3: build legal and public credibility. I needed more than anger, I needed authority. Laura lined up an experienced civil litigator to draft a countersuit for emotional distress and fraud. Jordan tapped a PR consultant who specialized in crisis narratives. They advised that releasing the truth too early would let my parents craft denial after denial. We planned an ordered reveal, legal filings first, then a targeted media piece, then shareholder notices, so every institution that mattered would see the factual record before the spin doctors could spin. Step 4. Set the trap. They were arrogant, believing a private letter and a few sympathetic attorneys would force me to negotiate. That arrogance became a lever. We arranged for a special board meeting of Thompson Tech's largest investors under the pretense of governance clarity. I would present the evidence there, a slide deck with bank trails, sworn affidavits, and a timeline that made their claim absurd. While the board stunned, Laura would file for emergency injunctive relief to stop any freezes on my accounts. Simultaneously, Sam would share his report with regulatory bodies. The goal: clear my name in every marketplace where their false narrative could take hold. Step 5. Safeguards and contingencies. We duplicated files across encrypted drives, mailed hard copies to trusted friends, and loaded an auto-release packet to a secure journalist if anything happened to me. If they tried to retaliate publicly, we had legal recourse. If they tried behind-the-scenes maneuvers, we'd expose it. Every move had a countermove. All the while, Richard and Evelyn lived as if nothing were wrong: dinner parties, social media posts, smug messages about family first. Their confidence made them blind. They believed they still controlled the story. The night before the board meeting, I sat alone in my office. The evidence packet lay fanned across my desk like playing cards. Laura's text blinked: "Once you present, there's no turning back. Are you ready?" I nodded even though she couldn't see me. I opened my laptop, the cursor blinking on the file labeled board_presentation_final.pdf. My hand hovered over the mouse. One click would distribute the deck to the investors, trigger the injunctive filing, and set the press embargo to lift at the appointed hour. It was the moment everything switched from plan to action. Then, just as I pressed down, there was a knock at my office door, 3 firm, measured rap taps that stopped my breath cold. The knock at the door froze my hand, then I moved, clicked, and the room erupted into motion. My slide deck bloomed across the boardroom screen. Investor faces tightened into masks of disbelief. For a beat, the only sound was the faint hum of the projector. Then I began. "Good morning," I said, voice steady. "What you're about to see is the full record of how my parents turned neglect into a business model, and then tried to bill me for it." Sam's spreadsheet scrolled across the screen, wire routes, timestamps, and beneficiary names. Sam narrated calmly: "See the clusters here, here, and here, transfers routed through shell entities, labeled as legacy accounts and parental services." The forensic accountant's affidavit appeared next, clinical and irreducible. The signatures matched, the routing codes checked out, and the timing corresponded to the exact dates my parents claimed they'd invested in my upbringing. The first murmur rippled through the room. My father's lawyer shot to his feet, voice sharp. "This is hearsay, fabricated," Laura cut him off. "We have bank records, notarized correspondences, eyewitness testimony, and a sworn affidavit from a fiduciary who handled the trust for 20 years. This isn't opinion, it's evidence." I moved through the timeline like a prosecutor: Christmases they skipped, awards nights they missed, the scholarship appeals unanswered. Each omission was a ledger entry, each ledger entry their claimed justification. I pointed to one slide: photos of childhood certificates with payment stamps, tax returns with gifts to cousins, and emails where my mother questioned why I needed a loan. The room went quiet enough to hear the clock. Then came the pivot. I unsealed the countersuit Laura had filed that morning: claims for emotional damages, punitive damages for fraud, and a motion for emergency injunctive relief to prevent any asset freezes on my business. The deck automatically routed to every investor's inbox. Sam hit send on the press embargo, Mara's headline cued to post the moment we finished. In 3 moves, private humiliation became public reckoning. Outside, phones lit up. Tweets turned into threads. Headlines materialized, family feud or fraud? Self-made CEO countersues parents. Donors called, not to cancel support, but to ask how they could help. The board chair, pale, looked at my parents' lawyer and said what no one had said to them in years, explain your stewardship. Now. Panic set in. My parents, the architects of their own entitlement, scrambled theatrically, denials, theatrical outrage, the old gaslight routines. A trustee who'd once been their ally withdrew, citing irregularities. Banks placed holds on accounts tied to the shell entities. Regulators opened probes into the legacy transfers. Social invitations vanished from their calendars. Their name, once a social key, became a search term for scandal. On the courthouse steps, cameras gathered like storm clouds. Papers were filed. The judge's clerk read the relief order aloud: freeze, preserve, investigate. For the first time in decades, the people who'd ignored me watched their world contract into a legal box they could not charm their way out of. I didn't shout. I didn't gloat. I closed the final file, slid it into its folder, and watched the footage of my parents, stunned, small, and suddenly ordinary, on the news monitors. The empire they'd tried to claim as theirs unraveled under the weight of truth. Outside the boardroom windows, the city moved on. Inside, I let myself exhale. I had defended what I'd built, exposed the scheme, and reclaimed my name. I folded the cream-colored envelope, my parents' letter, and placed it atop the folder. Then I wrote 3 words on the front and set it back on the desk: paid. In. Full weeks passed, but the echoes of that boardroom showdown still resonated. Richard and Evelyn Thompson were left exposed, their reputations in ruins. The courts had frozen the disputed accounts, investigations had begun into the shell entities they'd created, and every institution they had once wielded like a shield now looked at them with suspicion. Their carefully curated social image crumbled, leaving only the stark reality: arrogance and entitlement could not hide the truth. For me, the aftermath was liberating. I reclaimed full control over Thompson Tech Solutions, my company thriving stronger than ever. Investors, initially anxious, praised the transparency and resilience I demonstrated. Donors and colleagues rallied, sending messages of admiration and support. I even found myself mentoring a few young entrepreneurs, eager to teach them that independence and integrity could survive betrayal, and even flourish in spite of it. My personal life shifted, too. With the weight of their false claims lifted, I could breathe without fear, speak without caution, and plan for the future on my terms. Mia, my little niece, visited often. She held my hand as we walked through the city parks I had once explored alone, a living reminder of the strength that comes from surviving neglect. Occasionally, news alerts flared with updates on my parents' ongoing legal struggles. Each story felt like quiet poetry, the architects of my suffering brought down not by chance, but by the consequences of their own greed and deceit. I didn't gloat. Justice, I realized, has a way of speaking louder than anger ever could. One evening, as I filed the last of the final documents in my office, I paused and looked out over the city skyline. Lights shimmered like stars reflected on glass, and I felt a calm certainty that this chapter was closed. I whispered to myself, those who sow neglect and greed often forget that the seeds they plant can grow into the roots that bind them. That was poetic justice enough. And now, I want to speak directly to you, yes, you watching this story unfold. Have you ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you? Have you been ignored, underestimated, or manipulated? I want to hear your story. Share it in the comments. Stand tall in the face of betrayal, and remember, survival is only the beginning. If this story resonated with you, If you've ever faced injustice and longed for vindication, subscribe to follow more journeys of courage, strategy, and triumph. Because sometimes, the ones who ignore us the most end up learning what it truly means to be powerless. And as I close this chapter, one thought remains clear: neglect may steal years, but it can never steal the power of someone determined to rise. The world moved on outside, but inside, I had finally reclaimed everything: respect, freedom, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that I was no longer a victim. The end.